A single Greek word, 8 letters long, split the Christian world for more than 50 years. It isn't in the Bible. Most people who call themselves Christian today, if you stop them on the street and ask them to define it, couldn't do it. And yet in the summer of 325 AD, a few hundred bishops gathered in a small town in modern-day Turkey argued for weeks over whether that single word belonged in the official definition of who Jesus Christ actually was. And the emperor, who had summoned them to settle the matter once and for all, ended up, by the end of his own life, quietly siding with the side that lost. The meeting is called the Council of Nicaea, and it is usually remembered as the moment Christianity finally decided what it believed. What actually happened is far messier, far more political, and far less settled than the popular version of the story suggests, and the argument it supposedly resolved didn't really end for another 56 years. To understand why a religious dispute became urgent enough for a Roman emperor to personally intervene, you have to understand what kind of emperor Constantine actually was by 325. He had defeated his rival Magnentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, an event he and later Christian writers, especially the bishop and historian Eusebius of Caesarea, associated with a vision that pushed him toward favoring Christianity. And he had defeated his remaining co-emperor Licinius in 324, becoming sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire for the first time in decades. Constantine had spent over a decade cultivating Christianity as a unifying force within his territories, granting the church legal status and significant privileges through the Edict of Milan in 313 and pouring resources into church construction. By 325, having just unified an empire that had been politically fractured for most of his lifetime, the last thing Constantine wanted was to discover that the religion he had bet so heavily on was itself fracturing from within. The fracture in question had been building for several years in Alexandria, one of the most important and intellectually influential cities in the Christian world. A presbyter, a senior priest named Arius, had been teaching a position regarding the nature of Jesus Christ that his own bishop, Alexander of Alexandria, considered dangerously wrong. Arius's core argument, as it survives in fragments quoted by his opponents, was that the Son of God had been brought into existence by the Father, and that there was therefore a point, logically, if not necessarily in ordinary time, before which the Son did not exist. Arius and his supporters argued this preserved a strict, philosophically coherent monotheism. Only the Father was truly eternal and underived, and the Son, however exalted, was ultimately a created being, the first and greatest of creation, but not equal to the Father in the deepest sense. To Alexander, and to his energetic young deacon Athanasius, who would spend most of the rest of his life fighting this exact battle, that position effectively demoted Christ to something less than fully divine, undermining the entire logic of Christian salvation as they understood it. Alexander excommunicated Arius around 321, but Arius had real support among other bishops in the East, and rather than resolving the dispute, the excommunication simply spread it, as Arius traveled and corresponded, building a network of sympathetic clergy across Syria, Asia Minor, and beyond. By the time Constantine became sole emperor in 324, this theological dispute had become, in his eyes, an immediate political problem. According to Eusebius, who had direct access to Constantine's correspondence and quotes from it extensively in his Life of Constantine, the emperor first attempted a lighter touch, sending a personal letter urging Alexander and Arius to reconcile and dispatching a trusted Spanish bishop, Hosius of Cordoba, to investigate and mediate on the ground in Egypt. That effort failed, A regional church council convened at Antioch in the early months of 325, intended as a preliminary step, ended up provisionally condemning a version of Arius's teaching, but the dispute clearly required something larger and more authoritative than a regional gathering to have any chance of sticking. Constantine made the decision to convene what he intended as a truly general council of the entire Christian church, the first of its kind in Christian history, and to do so under his own personal sponsorship. He chose the town of Nicaea, modern Iznik in northwestern Turkey, for reasons that were largely practical. It sat on a lake with reasonably easy access by both road and water for bishops traveling from across the empire. It was close enough to Constantine's own residence at Nicomedia that he could attend in person without abandoning the administration of the rest of the empire, and it apparently had an imperial palace or similarly suitable facility capable of housing a gathering of that scale. Constantine paid for the bishop's travel and lodging out of imperial funds, a detail Eusebius records with evident approval, framing it as an act of generous piety. Though it also meant the emperor who funded the council held considerable practical leverage over how it would be conducted. Estimates for how many bishops actually attended vary across ancient sources, and the uncertainty itself tells you something about how the event was remembered versus how it was experienced at the time. Eusebius, writing as a participant, gives a figure of more than 250. The number that became traditional and is most commonly cited today, 318, comes primarily from Athanasius, writing some years later. And modern historians have noted that this specific number carries an odd resonance. It matches the number of armed servants Abraham is said to command in the book of Genesis, which has led some scholars to treat the figure with at least mild suspicion as a symbolically meaningful round number rather than a precise head count. What is not in dispute is that the overwhelming majority of attendees came from the eastern half of the empire, where the Arian controversy had actually originated and where the bulk of the Greek-speaking church was concentrated. The Western Church, including the Bishop of Rome, Sylvester the First, was represented only thinly. Sylvester himself did not attend in person, citing his advanced age, and sent 2 priests as his representatives instead, a detail worth remembering given how heavily later tradition would lean on Nicaea as a moment of supposedly universal church consensus. Constantine opened the council in person, and Eusebius, who was present and recorded the scene directly, describes the emperor entering in an ornate but deliberately modest manner, delivering an opening address in Latin, translated for the assembled Greek-speaking bishops, urging unity and warning against the dangers of internal division at a moment when the empire itself had just been unified after years of civil war. Constantine was not a bishop and held no formal authority to vote on doctrine, and ancient accounts are consistent that he did not attempt to dictate theological conclusions directly. His role, as both Eusebius's account and the broader structure of the proceedings suggest, was closer to that of a powerful, deeply invested moderator. He set the agenda, controlled the logistics, and exerted enormous indirect pressure simply by being the man who had called the meeting, funded it, and would ultimately have to enforce whatever it decided. The theological debate itself, once underway, was genuinely contentious, and the surviving fragments and later accounts suggest it was not a quick or foregone conclusion. Arius's position had real defenders present, including the influential bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, a man with close personal ties to the imperial court who would remain one of the most effective opponents of the council's eventual conclusion for years afterward. The central question the assembled bishops wrestled with was how to describe, in precise language, the relationship between the Father and the Son in a way that excluded Arius's position without sliding into the opposite error of suggesting there were simply two gods. The solution the majority eventually settled on was to describe the Son as homoousios with the Father, a Greek term meaning of the same substance, or of the same essence. This was the word that would define the controversy for the next half-century, and it is worth pausing on how unusual a choice it actually was. Homoousios does not appear anywhere in the New Testament. It is a philosophical term, borrowed from earlier Greek metaphysical vocabulary, and several bishops who were personally opposed to Arius's theology still felt uneasy adopting language that wasn't directly scriptural, since it opened the council to the accusation of imposing pagan philosophical categories onto Christian revelation. Some later sources, including the church historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing roughly a century afterward, suggest Constantine himself personally favored and possibly proposed the specific term, reportedly on the advice of Hosius of Cordoba, though modern historians treat this claim with some caution, given how favorably later writers tended to credit Constantine with theological insight he likely did not personally possess in technical detail. Eusebius of Caesarea's own position during the debate is itself a useful window into how contested the final wording really was, precisely because he was not a committed partisan on either side going in. Eusebius later wrote a letter to his own congregation back in Caesarea, explaining why he had ultimately signed the creed despite having walked into the council holding a noticeably more moderate, Arian-leaning formula of his own. A letter that survives and that several modern historians treat as one of the most candid first-hand accounts of the pressure bishops were under to fall in line with the emerging consensus. Eusebius describes seeking and receiving reassurance from Constantine himself that the term homoousios should not be understood in a crudely physical sense, as though the Father and Son shared substance the way two material objects might, before he felt able to add his signature. That a bishop who had been present in the room still felt the need to write home justifying his own vote says something important about how settled the matter genuinely felt to the people who had actually been there. Whatever the precise origin of the word, the council adopted it, producing what is now known as the Nicene Creed, a formal statement declaring the Son to be begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, eternally existing rather than brought into being at any point. Arius himself, along with a small handful of bishops who refused to sign the resulting document, were condemned and exiled by imperial order, Arius initially to Illyricum in the Balkans. It is worth being precise here about what the council actually accomplished in the room versus what later memory assigned to it. A majority of the bishops present, under very real political and social pressure from an emperor who had personally funded and convened the gathering, signed a document condemning a minority position. That is a real and historically significant outcome. It is not, however, the same thing as universal or lasting consensus, and what happened over the following decades makes that distinction unavoidably clear. The council also addressed matters that had nothing directly to do with the Arian controversy, and these are worth mentioning because they show Nicaea functioning, in a more mundane sense, as exactly the kind of administrative church gathering its organizers intended. The bishops produced 20 canons, formal disciplinary rulings, covering issues ranging from the proper ranking and authority of clergy in major sees, to specific prohibitions such as barring men who had voluntarily castrated themselves from ordination, a practice associated with certain ascetic extremists of the period, to addressing the Meletian schism in Egypt, a separate and largely unrelated dispute over the treatment of clergy who had wavered during earlier persecutions. The council also took up the question of how to calculate the date of Easter, since different regions of the Christian world, particularly the churches of Syria and Antioch, had been calculating it on a different schedule than the rest of the church, often tied more closely to the Jewish Passover calendar. The bishops at Nicaea pushed for a more uniform method, calculated independently, though full uniformity in practice took considerably longer to achieve across the wider Christian world than the council's ruling alone might suggest. What happened immediately after the bishops dispersed is where the popular memory of Nicaea as a moment of final resolution breaks down most clearly. Arius's removal from his position did not end the theological movement associated with his name, and his supporters, particularly bishops like Eusebius of Nicomedia, who held genuine influence at court, worked steadily over the following years to reverse the council's verdict through political rather than purely theological means. By 328, remarkably only 3 years after the council, Constantine had already recalled Arius from exile, apparently persuaded that Arius's actual personal beliefs, as Arius himself now described them in more careful language, were closer to orthodoxy than his earlier condemned statements suggested. Athanasius, who had succeeded Alexander as Bishop of Alexandria in 328 and had become the single most relentless defender of the Nicene formula, found himself increasingly at odds with an imperial court that was growing steadily more sympathetic to Arius and his allies. Athanasius was formally exiled from his own see for the first time in 335, on charges that modern historians generally treat as largely political pretexts rather than genuine theological complaints. It would not be his last exile. Over the following 4.5 decades, Athanasius was driven from Alexandria a total of 5 separate times, by 5 different emperors or imperial regimes, spending roughly 17 years of his episcopate in exile altogether. A remarkable testament to just how unsettled the supposedly settled question of Nicaea actually remained. The most striking measure of how far the political tide turned against the Nicene position came at the very end of Constantine's own life. In 337, on his deathbed, Constantine was baptized, the only baptism he is recorded as having received, having delayed it for years in keeping with a fairly common practice among converts of the period who wished to be baptized as close to death as possible to maximize the cleansing effect of the rite. The bishop who performed that baptism was Eusebius of Nicomedia, the very same court bishop who had been one of Arius's most committed and politically effective defenders throughout the entire controversy. The emperor, who had convened Nicaea specifically to crush the Arian position, died receiving his final sacrament from one of that position's chief architects, a detail recorded without apparent embarrassment by Eusebius of Caesarea in his admiring biography of the emperor, and one that later, more strictly, Nicene historians found considerably more uncomfortable to address directly. The decades that followed Constantine's death saw the controversy intensify rather than fade. Constantine's sons divided the empire and, at various points, pursued openly contradictory religious policies, with the Eastern court frequently favoring some variation of Arian or semi-Arian theology, while the Western Church remained more consistently committed to the Nicene formula. One faction that emerged prominently during these decades, often labeled by modern historians as the Homoiousians, proposed an alternative term, homoiousios, meaning of similar substance rather than of the same substance, differing from the Nicene formula by the addition of a single Greek letter, the iota. The dispute between these two camps became famous enough in its own time, and infamous enough to later observers that the controversy is sometimes referred to with the degree of pointed irony that contemporary participants would likely have rejected as a war fought over a single letter of the alphabet. The theological distance involved was not actually as trivial as the wordplay suggests, since the difference between sameness and mere similarity of substance carried real implications for how fully divine the Son was understood to be. But the episode illustrates just how granular and how genuinely unresolved the technical debate remained for an entire generation after Nicaea supposedly closed it. Multiple subsequent councils at Antioch, at Sirmium, and elsewhere through the 340s, 350s, and 360s produced a confusing succession of competing creeds, some explicitly rejecting the term homoousios in favor of vaguer or differently nuanced language, reflecting just how contested the original Nicene settlement remained for an entire generation after the bishops who had signed it were dead. It was not until 381, 56 years after the original council, under the firmly pro-Nicene Emperor Theodosius I, that a new general council convened at Constantinople formally reaffirmed and expanded the Nicene Creed into the form still recited in churches today, and began the systematic process of suppressing Arian Christianity within the borders of the Roman Empire itself through explicit legal penalties. Even that suppression, it is worth noting, did not eliminate Arian Christianity from the wider world. Arian missionaries had already converted several of the Germanic peoples living along and beyond the empire's frontiers during the 4th century, including the Goths and later the Vandals, and Arian Christianity persisted as the dominant form of the faith among several of these groups for generations after Orthodox Nicene Christianity had been fully restored within Roman territory itself, a lingering legacy of the very controversy Nicaea was supposed to have permanently resolved more than a century earlier. None of this is meant to suggest the Council of Nicaea was unimportant or that its conclusions were arbitrary. The theological reasoning behind the Nicene formula, developed and refined by figures like Athanasius over decades of sustained argument, represents one of the most carefully worked out positions in the history of Christian thought, and the eventual triumph of that position in 381 shaped, in a very direct and traceable way, the doctrine held by the overwhelming majority of Christian churches, Catholic, Orthodox, and most Protestant traditions alike, for the 17 centuries that followed. The point is simply that the popular shorthand version of the story, a single decisive meeting that settled Christian belief once and for all, badly understates how contested, how politically entangled, and how genuinely uncertain the outcome remained for most of the rest of that century. The bishops who walked out of Nicaea in the summer of 325 did not walk out of a finished argument. They walked out of the opening round of one that would outlast most of them, outlast the emperor who convened it, and very nearly outlast the very document they had just signed. If stories like this, where the moment everyone remembers as the ending turns out to be closer to the beginning, are the kind of thing you're into, the channel is called Urbex. No pressure at all, just more of this waiting for you if you want it.